Shoofly pie. As a kid growing up in Pennsylvania Dutch country, I never really had the appreciation for this Pennsylvania Dutch specialty as I should have. For me, it was everywhere, being sold at every grocery store, even at roadside stands along country roads in rural Pennsylvania. It wasn't until I got older until I realized that few people outside of Pennsylvania have even heard of it. It's a molasses-based pie, which molasses is a very useful ingredient, retaining water, so it'll add moisture to your cookies or gingerbread, but it's rarely front and center like in shoofly pie. Shoofly pie and molasses in general have a reputation for being very, very sweet, but that's not exactly the whole story. Sure, it is a byproduct of the sugar making process. It's what's left over after you extract sugar out of sugarcane, but there's also bitterness in there and umami. That's a lot going on for sugarcane, something that people credit for just being the source of sugar. So today, I'm going to highlight the flavors of molasses by baking a shoofly pie, and then have the perfect beer to pair it with. I've heard the term molasses a lot to describe aged malty beers like barley wine, and I think J.W. Lee's Harvest Ale is the perfect candidate. They vintage date each batch, and the bottle I have is from 2013, making it 13 years at the time of tasting, giving plenty of time for the malt to develop those molasses-like characters. So I can't wait to taste these two together on this episode of Bacon a Brew. There are two main types of shoofly pie, wet bottom and dry bottom. We'll be doing a wet bottom today. I'll start out with 180 grams of all-purpose flour and 1 stick of butter ice cold. I'll add to that half a teaspoon of salt, and then pulse in the food processor until all the butter is absorbed by the flour. I'll then add 1 tablespoon of vodka. Vodka evaporates faster than water, so it should help make the pastry nice and flaky. And then I'll add a small amount of water. We could always add more later. We just need enough to get the dough to a good consistency. I'll dump that onto my counter, and without kneading it too aggressively, I just want to form it into a flat disc. And I'll chill this for about an hour before rolling out. After the dough is chilled, I'll flour my work surface, as well as my rolling pin. A little extra flour on top of the dough, and I'll pound this out before rolling. For some reason, this seems more gentle on a dough. I'll then roll it out until it's a little bigger than my pie dish. If cracks start to form around the outside, I'll just push those back together. And I'll flip it every now and then just to make sure I roll everything out evenly. I'll line up my pie dish to see if it's about the right size, and when I'm happy with the size, I'll roll it loosely on my rolling pin, and then lift it into the pie dish. I'm trying not to push it down, but rather lift the dough and letting it fall in on its own. And then just gently push it around the sides. Cut off any excess dough. Admittedly, I don't have enough dough to be very fancy with the edges, so I'll just press it in with my fingers to make little dimple patterns. Now, a lot of shoofly pie recipes don't involve doing a blind bake, and maybe it's because I'm using a glass baking dish, but I've always had trouble with my crust being underbaked. So I'm going to dock the dough with a fork, and then lay down a piece of parchment paper before filling with dried beans or pie weights. I'll bake this at 400 degrees for about 20 minutes. Then remove the pie weights and bake it another 5 minutes. While that's baking, I'll move on to the crumb mixture. I'll start with 180 grams of all-purpose flour and add 120 grams of brown sugar. Add another teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of cinnamon, and I'll grind up some nutmeg until I lose grip of the nutmeg and it flies across my kitchen. I'll then add 3 ounces of butter and use my fingers to work everything together. That is until I realize that I already have my food processor out, and that would be a whole lot easier. And now I'll move on to the filling, featuring our main ingredient, molasses. Now I'm going to need to stop for a moment to talk about molasses, because a lot of recipes would just list molasses as an ingredient. But there are different grades of molasses, so it is important to know a little bit about the process. Molasses comes from sugarcane. The sugarcane is ground and the juice is boiled until sugar crystallizes. The sugar is then removed to be sold as white sugar, and what's left behind is light molasses. It still retains a little bit of the sugar, but it's a little darker in color. You take that, boil it again until even more sugar crystallizes, remove that, and the resultant liquid is even darker in color, and the flavors are further concentrated, concentrating the other flavors and nutrients into molasses. And that's your dark molasses. Do this again, remove even more sugar, and then you'll have blackstrap molasses, which is the most intense flavor of molasses. Now what I'm getting at is that the darker and more concentrated your molasses, the less sweet and more bitter it's going to be, because every step along the way you're removing sugars and concentrating all the other flavors. So if you're making a shoofly pie, you're going to want to know if you're using a light molasses or a blackstrap molasses. But there's even one more step in a molasses making process, because I did mention that it might have a little bit of that umami character. Well, scientists figured out that you could get a lot of glutamic acid by fermenting molasses with a bacteria called Corynebacterium. This resulting liquid is very rich in glutamic acid, at which point they could add sodium that bonds to the glutamic acid, creating monosodium glutamate, also known as the very controversial MSG. Now, you might have heard that MSG was extracted out of seaweed, and that is how it was originally discovered, but they figured out that it was a lot more efficient to get it out of the fermentation of sugarcane. So if you thought sugarcane was just a vehicle for white sugar, there's so much more to it than that. As far as what I'm using today, I think I'm going to stick with the dark molasses. It's more complex than a light molasses, not quite as bitter as the blackstrap, so I think the dark molasses is going to be right in the range where we want for today. We'll add 3/4 cup of molasses, as well as 3/4 cup of boiling water. Molasses is famously viscous, so this should help mix it easier. And we'll also need 1 beaten egg. Now, just in case the mixture is too hot, I'm going to temper it with a little bit of that liquid before adding it to the full mix. I'll also add half a teaspoon of baking soda, which would make it foam up a little bit. I'll mix that all up and then add it to our blind bake pie crust. And I'll place that crumb topping on top, being careful not to mix it too much. I just want it floating on top. Now, inevitably, some of the filling will sneak to the top as it bakes, but I like to cover the whole thing anyway because I like it to create those natural fault lines on top. I'll then bake this in a 425-degree oven for 10 minutes before reducing the temperature to 350 and then baking it for another 30 minutes. And we're going to have to let this cool to let that wet bottom filling set. And there it is, a flaky pastry crust with a gooey molasses filling and topped with a spiced crumb topping. We'll pair this with a J.W. Lee's Harvest Ale, a 13-year-old aged barley wine. The malt flavor in this beer is so complex. You get a ton of that molasses flavor, but you also get a little bit of some darker fruits like plum and fig. You get almost no hops in it. What hop aroma there was probably faded a long time ago. The thing I love about this beer is that it takes advantage of an extremely underrated ingredient, and I'm not talking about malt, hops, or yeast. I'm talking about time. J.W. Lee's knows what they're doing when they put that vintage date on the bottle. They're telling you that this beer is best with a lot of age on it. Some interesting things happen to beer as it ages. Certain flavors like hops tend to fade over time, but the malt comes through even stronger, picking up flavors like the molasses, and you could even get some of that umami character, especially in beers with a lot of darker malts. And you could pick up some sherry character after it ages a couple years. Not every beer is a good candidate for aging, but the really strong, really malty beers, I think, are actually better after a couple years. My only regret with opening this bottle now is I'm missing the opportunity to do one of my favorite things, and that's to do a vertical tasting. When you have strong malty beers like this, it's really fun to grab a several year window and try some of the fresher stuff side by side with the older stuff and see exactly when the beer peaks. And this beer is 13 years old and it doesn't taste like it's past its prime. This drinks perfectly. I don't think I appreciated shoofly pie as much as I should have as a kid growing up in Pennsylvania Dutch country. As a kid, I just wanted something sweet, and a lot of people think that's what shoofly pie is going to be when they see how much molasses in it. But now that I learned about those flavors, it's the other elements of molasses that I find interesting. The bitterness of it, the concentrated flavors, even a little bit of that umami. I think an aged beer is the perfect thing to pair with it. For me, the shoofly pie has the perfect amount of sweetness. You do have a little flexibility. You could use the light molasses, or if you want something really aggressive, you could go ahead and use the blackstrap molasses. But I find this is middle of the road is just perfect. There's just a touch of sweetness, and then you got a lot of that concentrated molasses flavor. Thank you for watching, and join me next time when I take another one of my favorite classic beers and try to find the perfect bake to pair with it.